So this is a continuation, really, of the theme we started last week as we looked at the disciples who were sent out onto the Sea of Galilee, and if you read in John chapter 6, it actually says in John 6, verse 16, that, verse 17, when they got into the boat, they set off across the lake for Capernaum. And as we know, as they were headed there, they were caught and they were unable, because of the contrary wind, to keep going. But they saw Jesus walking on the water. And their reaction, as we talked about last time, was actually very understandable from a human standpoint. They were absolutely scared out of their wits when they saw someone coming to them walking on water. But what they were seeing was more of who Jesus was. And yet over and over they struggled to see the reality of who Jesus is. Mark comments at the end of that section that they didn't even recognize the significance of what Jesus had just done on shore in feeding 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Their hearts were hardened. Now, this is the disciples we're talking about. So it's not talking about some sort of, evil aspect so much as it's just saying this is the condition that they were in, that they were unable to see. But it says a lot about our inability to see. As they were headed, though, to Capernaum, what we read in this passage is that they do not actually land at Capernaum. They land in the area of Gennesaret. Now that's interesting because Jesus had given them directions to cross the sea, but through circumstances, even with Jesus coming to them, they are redirected to a bit of a different place. Now, as I was reading in one commentary, that where they ended up was actually still in walking distance to Capernaum, and according to the book of John, they did end up in Capernaum, but first landing in Gennesaret, they had to minister where they were. And as I read about this, it reminds me of how last week we talked about how God puts us in circumstances in order to reveal more of who He is. But also what we see in this is that sometimes where we think we're going is not where we end up. And God may redirect us at times, but He has a reason for redirecting us. He has a reason for putting us where we are. And when we end up in that place, there are opportunities that God gives us to do His work. We can even call these divine encounters, because as Jesus ends up in this area, He is now going to minister to people in that place that they're in. And God will often do this in our lives. We will end up in a certain situation, and we will actually encounter people that we never expected to encounter, and God gives us an opportunity to minister to the people that He places in our lives. Those are divine encounters. It is not a mistake that God has you where you are. From a human standpoint, we can be very frustrated and say, well, things aren't going according to plan. Well, they're not going necessarily according to your plan, but they are going according to God's plan. So at the very beginning of this, we see that the disciples are, by God's direction, now in a different area as they're eventually making their way to Capernaum. Last week, we saw how there was the hard-heartedness of the disciples. What we see in this passage is human longing. So though humans have a tendency often to be hard-hearted and not see what they ought to see, there is still human longing. And what we read in this passage, in verse 53, and they land at Gennesaret and anchored there. Verse 54, as soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. That's the first point we see here, is that people recognize Jesus. Now, I have to put a caveat here because of the theme that we're talking about and say they kind of recognized Him. Did they fully understand who He was? Not for the most part. But on one level, they were coming to a deepening understanding of who He was. Early on in Jesus' ministry, a lot of people didn't have any idea who he was. We talked about how he came from a very obscure place, Nazareth, and people were stunned that someone like this would come from Nazareth. But there is a growing, deepening awareness of who Jesus is. Last week I mentioned a man named Dr. Jordan Peterson, and how when he was pressed by an atheist, do you think if there was a video recording of the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea on the Sunday that Christians celebrate as Resurrection Sunday, do you think someone actually stepped out of that tomb? And Jordan Peterson, who historically was much more of a secular thinker, if you will, maybe that's not the label he would like, but that's how I would label him. He said, I suspect that we would see someone coming out of that tomb. I just saw yesterday, thanks to the YouTube algorithm, that Jordan Peterson has just done an interview with Pastor Greg Laurie. I don't know how many of you know who that pastor is, but he's a very evangelistic pastor. And it kind of shocked me because Peterson now has an evangelical pastor that he's interacting with on his show. And so I really do believe we see in someone like him an example of kind of a growing awareness of who Jesus is, even listening to more and more people that are sharing Scripture directly with him. Well, that's what's happening with the people as the disciples come to Gennesaret. They're coming to a better understanding of who Jesus is. And the second thing we read as they recognize him is that in verse 55, they ran throughout the whole region and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. So what is happening here is that people are recognizing him, and wherever he's going, they are bringing people to him, and they are coming to him. And that brings up a very important reminder to us about people, that they will come to a source when they think there are answers in that source. When they think that there are needs that are able to be met, they will come to that place. Now, we have to admit that often people will go to the wrong source for the answers to their needs or their problems. I think of how many books are out there in the bookstores and all over the place that are supposed to give us answers to our problems. And we call this nowadays, I love this, this is our culture, the self-help section. Now, if we were able to do such a good job with ourselves, why would we be in that place in the first place? Right? We're not very good at it, at helping ourselves. But what these books are telling us is you can find the answer in yourself if you read the insights that are in this book. And I was thinking about this, that these books are a little bit like the Wikipedia handbook for our souls. Because Wikipedia, you can get information, but that information might be not exactly accurate. And so when you're reading these books, there might be some good information, but a lot can be misguided or even missing. There might be information that the book is telling you that maybe is good on some level, but it's not giving you the full picture. It's not ultimately going to be able to give you the full answer to who God created you to be. Because a lot of these books are just based on human-to-human understanding rather than an understanding of the one who created you. So people will come to the wrong source, or they may come to the right source. Now, in this case, they're coming to the right source. They're coming to Jesus. But still, people can come to the right source with the wrong motive. My father pastored for many years. And I remember him telling me when I was young about people who would come to him for pastoral counseling. And sometimes he admitted it could be very frustrating because there were some people who would come repeatedly and he would give them counsel, but they wouldn't do what he was telling them they should do. And what that can reveal is that sometimes people go to the right place, they're looking to the right place for answers, they want to hear what God says, but they're not necessarily willing to listen to God. Because maybe what they really want is, I just don't want to have to deal with this consequence. I don't want to have to deal with something in my life, but I don't really want to have to do what God says in order to solve the problem. And maybe there's some sort of a misguided motive. People here are coming to Jesus and they want to be healed. That's not bad, but do they really understand their deepest need? So people come to Jesus. They recognize him, they come to him, and then we read on here, verse 56, wherever he went, into villages, towns, or countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplaces, and they begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched him were healed. So the third point here is that people, as they come to him, people were healed by him. One commentator talks about that this is possibly in a region where they had previously rejected him. But now, instead of rejecting Jesus, they are coming and they're being healed of him. And as they're being healed, they're experiencing his work in their lives. And I love this because even though previously they may have rejected him, and even though they may not fully understand who he is, does Jesus put that as a barrier in order to help them? Absolutely not. He cares about these people with the level of understanding that they have. Just the fact that they're coming to him, he is willing to heal them. When it comes to how people perceive Jesus, it is, as I said before, a growing awareness that has to take place. And I do really like this, that in one translation, this is the Legacy Standard Bible, and I'm gonna have to explain something about this. Some of you understand this, and some of you this would be new to you. But at the end of the verse here, and you can read it in your translation, the end of this verse, you'll see here that it is in italics. Now, what does that mean? That's actually, those words are not in the original language. So you might read in a translation like the ESV or the NIV that they came and as many as touched Jesus' garment were healed. But what do you read in this translation? We're being saved. Now, you know why they translated it that way? Because it's the same word that we often translate as saved. It's the same word, sozo. But in this case, what are they being saved from? Well, contextually, we can say, well, they're being healed of their sicknesses. But what do we know about Jesus? He has the power to save. And sometimes we miss the linguistic connections. That's why I wanted you to see it in this particular translations. That Jesus is able to save people. And they're going to him for physical healing, but we also recognize as we listen to Jesus and as we read all of Scripture that salvation involves so much more than just that surface physical healing. And the question is, will they seek the full experience that Jesus offers, the full experience of salvation? But in order for that to happen, the light must shine in their hearts. I was just so happening this morning to be watching a video that really tied in very well to what we're talking about here, because it was a video about rainbows. And this is so fascinating. The video is titled something like, "What you know about rainbows is probably wrong." It's probably wrong. But I have to admit, I don't know much about rainbows. Now I know a little bit more, and I wanted to just share with you something that was said as best as I can understand it. So put that caveat there that, this is me trying to explain what the video said, all right? But I'm not a scientist. But basically, when you look at a rainbow, I know I didn't realize what it is you're really looking at, what causes that to happen. We have a basic idea that the light of the sun is somehow being refracted in such a way that you're seeing all these colors. It's actually interesting that each droplet is actually reflecting a rainbow of colors, each droplet. But you have to be at just the right angle to that droplet and the light of the sun in order to see one particular color. So what you're actually seeing is some droplets are projecting red, and the angle I think they said for that is 42 degrees. And the last angle from the sun to the water to you is 40 degrees, and that's violet. And so each droplet is actually showing forth all those colors, but the angle is going to show you that particular color. And because the droplets are at different positions, you're getting all the different angles between 42 and 40 degrees. And on top of that, the droplets are moving. So what they said is actually what you're seeing is kind of an illusion. It's all these droplets are actually reflecting all of that light, but as they're falling and you're seeing the angle of that light, you're seeing the rainbow. Now, maybe that got a little too into the weeds for you, but here's what I think is amazing. The light that we see is always the nature that it is. But at some times, we're able to see it differently. Sometimes we're able to see more fully what's really there. And that is, I think, a good illustration of how it is with Jesus. There are a lot of people that can see him, but do they fully understand the nature of who he is? And light, remember, Jesus himself said that he is the light of the world. We'll look at that verse in a little bit. But he said he's the light of the world. What do scientists see about light today? It's absolutely an amazing concept when you think about what the nature of light. And scientists are just absolutely astounded when they research the nature of light. So as we reflect on this, a few points of application here. The people, remember when Jesus left the other side of the shore before he got here, the people wanted to make him king. And even as he goes to the other side of the shore here, the people are still seeking Jesus, but they're really seeking him to solve their immediate external problems. And the whole reason that Jesus had to leave the first place in order to go to Gennesaret is because people wanted to just immediately make him king so that they could fulfill all their desires. So it's not necessarily a bad impulse that people want him to be king, because Jesus is king. But the problem is they don't really understand their deepest need. When we say that we want Jesus to do something, the way that these people are thinking of it, it misses something key about the human condition. Because what we need is far deeper than just what we think of as an immediate need, a felt need, or maybe some sort of physical problem that we're having. Consider the story of the whole Bible, and you realize that the human condition is one of immense need. I just talked about the rainbow. It should make you think of a story in the Bible where the rainbow was given as a sign that God would never do this again. But the world was immersed in flood, in God's judgment on the world. Why did God flood the world? Now we know we know those cute little kid drawings that they make of Noah's Ark, but the biblical story is actually one that is very terrifying, because Noah has to escape this enormous flood that is wiping out humanity. Why does God do that? Because as he's observing humans, he's seeing that the intent of their heart continually is bent toward evil. We think about Israel, who was mercifully given an opportunity to be redeemed from slaves in Egypt and given their own land. And what did Israel do with that? They turned their back on God. They showed once again the inability of humans to do the right thing. And we can think of empires, empire after empire, and what has happened to them. They've come, they've built up their civilization, but ultimately it implodes. And when we look at human history, we see it's a big mess, don't we? And if we're honest, we have to admit we are still making messes. That's the human condition. Once we begin to recognize that, though, then we begin to understand how deep and immense our need is as humans, that we cannot be so oriented towards self-help. We need some help outside of ourselves, beyond ourselves. And so as they're looking to Jesus, it's not so much that they're looking to the wrong source, but they don't even understand what their true need is. And what they will begin to understand, if they have faith, is that Jesus is able to do something far more for them than they could ever imagine. Jesus is far greater of a person than they initially understood. It is a process of understanding and growing in your understanding and in your trust in Jesus. I just last week saw a testimony of a man who was living a sinful lifestyle in relationships, in romantic relationships, and was living in a way that was not according to God's design. And he did a video giving his testimony saying that I now am choosing at the moment to live as a single person. But people are asking him, why would you choose to live that way? And his answer to them is, because it's actually more satisfying to have a relationship with Jesus and to be honoring him than to live the sinful lifestyle that I lived before. Jesus is far greater than we can ever imagine, and his ability to help us in our need is beyond what we can fully fathom. But that's why Jesus came into the world. Remember, he is the light of the world. John 8:12, I am the light of the world, he says. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. So as the people are beginning to understand Jesus, what Jesus is showing here is that he is the light of the world. But in order for people to come to Jesus, in order for people to honor Jesus in the way that he should be honored, they have to receive that light. And I love what Paul goes on to tell us, the Apostle Paul in Ephesians chapter 5. At one time you were darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light, for the fruit of light is found in all that is good and right and true. And try to discern what is pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. So, when God shines his light in our hearts, we are able to understand more and more of who Jesus is. And what do we read here? That Jesus is the light of the world, and when we come to Christ in faith, we now are also children of light. And instead of walking in darkness, we now, and a lot of you know what it's like to walk in the dark, physically, it's hard. Spiritually, the same way. People cannot find their way, but when the light comes, they're able to see. God shines his light, and we're able to see. And now we walk as children of light. And what do? We don't walk in darkness. We expose the deeds of darkness. That's what light does. It sheds light on what is there. Well, to conclude all of this, recently on the bus, I'm going to go back to the rainbow, but recently on the bus, I was waiting for a little bit at a certain stop, and one person was on the bus, an older lady, and she looked out and she said, "Oh, look over there, it's a rainbow." And I looked, and sure enough, there was this beautiful, array of colors. No matter how long you've lived your life, rainbows are just beautiful things, aren't they? And they just evoke that reaction. Well, I was thinking about this for us as God's people. Remember what I said about a rainbow? It's actually all of the droplets are reflecting all of the light. Each one is actually giving off a rainbow. Well, we as God's people are children of light. And what do? As the light of God shines through our lives, we reflect that. And people are able to see more of who God is through his people. You could liken the church of God to a prism, right? And that prism is being used of God to reflect his glory. It's not the source of light, but it reflects the light and shows forth the beauty and the grandeur of God's glory. And so my prayer is that when God sees us, not just individually, by the way, but collectively, God will use that to show forth his glory. In order for people to experience the light, they have to see this. They have to be given new sight. Just like that woman looking out, she was able to see the rainbow. And when God gives people that sight, they're able to see, wow, I see it. And as they see that light that God gives them, they are able to see who Jesus really is. And my prayer is that God will use us to help people see who Jesus really is as we show forth his glory together as his church.